I'm with Lizzie Coyle from the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. So Lizzie, what is the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion?
Hi, it's good to be here. The Faraday Institute for Science and Religion is an academic research institute based in St Edmunds College at Cambridge University, and it was set up with the aim to reach into the academy and out to the wider public to look at the idea that science and religious faith not only sort of can rub alongside each other, contrary to the idea that we often are given in the media that science and religion are in conflict, but actually that the two work together beautifully. So that's what we do. We do a lot of research to look at how science and religion fit together, how they interact, from sort of the big questions of to do with the Big Bang and evolution and that kind of thing, to ideas of how people respond to natural disasters, how faith might come into that, things to do with social sciences and how we form our ideas about science and faith and philosophy and all that kind of thing. We also do a lot of communication, so we run a lot of courses and conferences and produce lots of media and resources for all different ages to help people explore these questions of science and faith that are a lot of the big questions in today's society.
Now, you're going to school. How well are you received in the school?
Really well, actually, generally. We get a lot of opportunities to go into schools to talk to all different age groups, which is a joy. And we go into lots of different schools for lots of different reasons. We sometimes go into science classes or religious education classes, sometimes to talk to a Christian Union group, to present a workshop or a lesson or an assembly, or kind of whatever it is that the school wants. So it's very flexible. It varies a lot depending on what the schools want, but generally the response is really good because it gives a kind of an opportunity to explore an interdisciplinary area. Often young people in schools get an opportunity to learn something about science in their science classes, and it's taught in a very particular way. Sort of, this is some stuff that we know about science that some people have discovered, and this is how we learn it. And then they sit and examine that, and then in another classroom they're told a bit about different types of religions and what different people think about those, but they're very rarely given the opportunity to actually think about how those two fit together, to think about how these two very different ways of thinking can interact to form part of the bigger worldview that we need to get through life, to really figure out life, to ask some of these bigger questions. So the kids love it. The schools are really supportive of any opportunity to do that, and it's really about encouraging young people to question, to think through the questions they have. We don't go in and sort of tell them answers, but it's about encouraging them to really think through, well, what am I learning? How do I apply this? How does this make sense to my life? How can I really think through these big questions?
And what sort of questions do they actually ask you?
Oh, an amazing range. I particularly love working with young people because they ask all of the questions that adults think are too silly to ask as well. So I mean, you get questions from things like, well, how do science and faith fit together? You know, the big obvious one for a start. You get a lot to do with, well, you know, what about the dinosaurs? How does that work with what we hear from Genesis? How do we interpret the Bible? Can the Bible be true if we don't necessarily think about it literally? Should we completely rely on everything we hear from science? You get a lot of questions about the Christian faith and how that applies generally. You know, you can go in to talk about the Big Bang or evolution or something and end up talking about suffering and how we fit with that. And so a lot of it opens up the questions that are in people's minds, from the kind of philosophical side through to some of the really, really deep stuff, because it gives an opportunity. It can take away some of the barriers to thinking about faith, thinking about science, how those fit. So a huge range of questions. Some of them very, very deep, some of them slightly less so. But there's a lot of fun to be had in that, and it's really valuable times often, those kind of question and answer sessions.
Now, a lot of teaching today is about evolution, and how do you dispel that myth that it's taught as a fact?
So I think it's really important to think through how we think about what science is and what science tells us, and how that relates to faith. So from a religious faith perspective, from a Christian perspective, to say, well, what are the most important things in thinking about science, thinking about the world, thinking about exploring the world that we believe God made, and thinking about God as creator. And to say that, I would say the first and most important thing is recognise, well, the Bible tells us that God is the creator. There are lots and lots of different opinions about how he chose to create. There's a lot of biblical interpretation that comes into that, but first and foremost we need to get our heads clear about, well, the Bible is most clear that God is the creator and that he wants relationship with us, and that the way we need to express that relationship with him and to each other is through grace. So the very first thing I would say in this is it's most important to recognise what's really central to this discussion, is that we need to be talking with grace. We need to be talking and discussing in a way that respects the other people in the conversation, and also seeks to glorify God through the way that we discuss it. So from there, obviously, that, like I say, there are lots of different opinions. There are many people involved in science who have a very strong faith, who are completely happy with the idea that evolution, as we understand it through science, describes a way in which God chose to create. And so a lot of those that work with us, and I myself, I'm very happy actually with that description as a way of the way in which God chose to create. I think as we look at the world around us, we see a beautiful world that we can begin to understand. You know, we believe God made us with the ability to explore and understand some of the creation around us, and science gives us ways of beginning to do that. And as we see that, we see these beautiful patterns in nature, these beautiful networks and functions and processes starting to unravel as we explore them more. And as we discover that, we see more and more of the wonder and the beauty and the awe in a creation that we believe an incredible God made.
Can God and the Big Bang mix?
Absolutely. Again, I think on a very similar understanding. One of the ways that I often try to explain it when I go into schools or when I talk to people is to think of science as exploring mechanism. This is what science does. It looks at very specific questions about the world around us. It explores a kind of mechanistic understanding. That's what evolution is looking at. It's the process by which life develops. The Big Bang is a kind of a heading given to the processes that we understand, or we're beginning to understand, about the way that the beginnings of the universe came about. It's looking very much at the mechanism of it. What science doesn't do is explore any kind of questions of meaning or purpose. And that's what our biblical teaching, what faith gives us. It's that sense of however this happened, whatever the mechanism, the meaning and purpose in this situation is attributable to God. And
so if there was a Big Bang, then it was God that created the Big Bang?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if we think about God creating, he created a natural world. It makes perfect sense to think, well, he did that through natural processes. If God is creating something, he's an amazing God. He's very creative. He's very powerful. And he created us in a way to understand that. So I personally am not at all surprised when we discover things through science that amaze us with how big and powerful and wonderful they appear to describe the development and creation of the world and universe around us. So.
Now, a lot of religion is just based on faith and not fact in one sense. How do you argue your corner with a scientist?
I think again we have to look very carefully at definitions here. We have to look very carefully about what we and the media around us and the people around us understand by the terms faith and fact and belief and evidence and all of these kind of things. It's important to know what we're talking about when we mean those. So to a lot of people, the media and the culture around us talk of faith as believing something contrary to the evidence, or believing something almost in spite of evidence against it. And I don't think that's a great description of the faith that we have in Jesus. For the most part, certainly that faith is something that we're encouraged to base on evidence, to look at the evidence of history, of the things in the world around us, and say, well, this makes sense. It makes sense to us to believe in Jesus. He's a God who stands up to questioning. So that kind of idea of faith is very, very different from the one that a lot of the media and the culture have. So then from that understanding, we get to this place of saying, well, if our faith is based on evidence, on understanding, then surely understanding of the world around us is something that we would look to fit with that. If I'm trusting and putting my faith in something that I believe stands up to the evidence around me, and I believe that God made the world, then as I look at the world, as I see what evidence that draws out, then I would hope that those things would fit together. And I and many others, not only who I work with, but throughout the history of science, people like Newton and Kepler and Galileo and all of these people, you know, have worked and looked at the world around them and seen actually this makes a lot of sense with an idea of a God who's a creator, you know, and using science as a way to explore that world, explore God's creation, is something that for many hundreds of years has been a really incredible pastime and very important in the way that science is done today.
So there are scientists today that are believers?
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds, thousands, all across the board. Several very well-known, very high up in science. A few off the top of my head. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project, which mapped out the human genome a few years ago. He's now the director of the National Institutes of Health. Over in America, he was an atheist, became a Christian during his medical studies, very open about his faith, his conversion, how his science relates to that. He wrote a fantastic book about genetics called The Language of God. Endless others in all kinds of different areas. Jennifer Wiseman is the project manager of the Hubble telescope at NASA. Simon Conway Morris is an evolutionary biologist. There are people working in genetics, in physics, astrophysics, in all different areas of science, who are Christians, who have a very strong belief and who see their science as worship to God. And as I say, it's been the case all throughout history as well.
Okay, Lizzie, well, thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure, thank you.